previous chapter argued that the atomistic approach to sensation cannot account for the context-dependent nature of perception. This chapter expands upon this argument by now claiming that empiricism, with its theory of associationism, fails to adequately account for perception, and in particular, the meaningfulness of perceptual experience. I'll present this chapter by first discussing the empiricist theory of associationism, its connection to memory, then followed by Merleau-Ponty's critique of this position and some examples he uses to illustrate his critique. The classical empiricist approach proposes that perception is built up from pure sense data, which in the previous chapter was shown to be erroneous, demonstrated through the various optical illusions. One of the difficulties with the empiricist position is the claim that perception is fully contingent upon immediate sense data, each time rebuilding the perception with every new sense data presentation. However, the empiricist can nuance this position by adding that there is a mental process by which connections are made between sensations, forming the basic building blocks for more efficiently producing perceptual experiences. Those connections are formed based on a set of principles. For example, sensations that resemble each other or that occur together in time and space get grouped together and recognized as a single object perception. These observed patterns are then stored in the mind as memories, allowing for rapid recognition of those patterns when encountering them in the future. This is known as associationism. John Locke, who we've discussed previously, famously introduced the concept of the association of ideas, while David Hume elaborated upon this view, radicalizing it to show how even the fundamental principles of science, such as cause and effect, are a byproduct of such associations rather than some intrinsic property of reality. As someone trained in the field of psychology, associationism figures prominently in that field as well, influenced especially by the behaviorists who theorize that all learning is built up by making links between sensory stimuli and behavioral responses, whether through pairing something like food to a sound, such that the sound produces the same behavioral response as the food, or by pairing behavior with consequences that either increases or decreases that behavior. As such, associationism is a theory that attempts to show how simple mental elements combine to form complex perceptions and actions. It can then account for those optical illusions addressed in the previous chapter by adding one more mental process, memory. The mind forms stored mental representations of sensory associations that can be then used to more efficiently recognize previously linked patterns of sensory data, and as well can fill in the gaps of information when sensory data is missing. But this filling in can lead to erroneous interpretations, giving rise to optical illusions and removing any need to propose that perception is intrinsically context dependent. The ultimate implication of the empiricist approach for the purposes of this chapter is that perception is itself a derivative process, fundamentally dependent on the mental faculties of association and memory for producing meaningful experiences. And since, for Merleau-Ponty, consciousness is inherently perceptual, the empiricist argument also renders consciousness itself derivative from causal factors extrinsic to consciousness itself. So we can see what might be at stake for Merleau-Ponty. Following Husserl's phenomenology, he wants to argue that perception is always intentional, always directed towards something in the world as such, and is always active and inherently meaningful and structured, not merely passively built up by a collection of isolated sensations. The central argument against empiricism made by Merleau-Ponty in this chapter is that association and memory necessarily presuppose the very unity of perceptions that these mental faculties are purported to provide. For associations to happen, there must already be an intrinsic unity and intelligibility of those perceived objects. It is not sufficient to say that the principles of proximity and resemblance account for this, since many perceived associated links violate these principles, and it does not logically follow that such associations should necessarily give rise to a unity that is not already present in the perception itself. Merleau-Ponty uses the example of a line with points A, B, and C to illustrate his point. According to Merleau-Ponty, the empiricist approaches this figure as separate isolated entities whose spatial arrangement is simply the sum of their positions. And any attempt to move beyond this by considering the relationships between these points still fails to explain the whole integrated perception. Resemblance or association, that is the connections and paths of A and B and C on this line or part of what's forming a larger circle, only recalls past images where one impression evokes another, but without truly explaining why they are connected. Ultimately, he thinks this view leads to nominalism, which rejects meaningful and unified categories in favor of meaning built up by arbitrary and vague resemblances or associations. Such an approach, however, cannot account for the apparent regularities of perceptual experience, offering instead an overly simplified reductionistic account of perception. This argument reminds me quite a bit of what in cognitive science is called the binding problem. The binding problem refers to the challenge in accounting for how the brain integrates diverse sensory information that is processed in distinct brain regions and yet can give rise to a unified, coherent perception of objects and experiences. So there's an area in the brain that processes red, another area separate from that processes shape, and then again another area that processes movement. And yet we don't experience these individual processes as separate things, but as one unified experience. And this binding problem intersects with what is called the hard problem of consciousness, which concerns how unified subjective experience arises from physical processes. And scholars like Hubert Dreyfus have even drawn upon Merleau-Ponty to address these particular problems in cognitive science. A similar argument can be made against the use of memory to give rise to perceptual experience. Merleau-Ponty asks, if recognition of patterns of sense data depends on memory, what triggers the memory in the first place? His answer is that the eliciting of such memories must depend upon a prior structure and meaning that is already built into the perceptual experience of an object. That recognition is a perceptual activity first, not a matter of memory. Thus, the idea of memories being projected onto perception is a misleading metaphor that oversimplifies how perception actually works. Meaning is intrinsic to perception itself, not something added on after the fact by memory. Meaningful perceptual experience arises from how present consciousness organizes and interprets sensory inputs in light of past experiences, rather than those meaningful experiences arising from those sensory inputs and past experiences. Merleau-Ponty uses several examples to illustrate his argument, three of which I'll elaborate on here. First, when we perceive a mountain, we immediately recognize it as a coherent, unified thing. This recognition doesn't arise because we associate the mountain with past experiences or memories. Rather, it is due to the intrinsic structure of our perceptual field, which organizes itself into things like this mountain and the spaces between things, such as the sky or surrounding landscape. For Merleau-Ponty, perception is not a process of piecing together isolated sensory inputs into a coherent whole. Instead, it is an act of directly apprehending meaningful wholes. The mountain is perceived as a mountain because perception itself is inherently organized and meaningful as such. It doesn't rely on external associations or mental constructs to achieve this unity. This painting here by Cezanne exemplifies this by showing how objects appear within a horizon of relationships rather than as isolated pieces of sensory data. Second, imagine you're walking along a shoreline and approaching a ship in the distance. At first, its funnel or mass might appear as disconnected shapes blending into the background of the sea and sky. Then, at some point, these elements suddenly click into place, and you perceive them as parts of a single object, the ship. This moment of recognition doesn't occur because your mind associates these shapes based on resemblance or proximity. Instead, it happens because perception operates as an overarching system that organizes disparate elements into a unified whole. For Merleau-Ponty, this example demonstrates that impressions, like isolated sensory details, cannot associate themselves independently. It is perception as a dynamic, holistic process that creates connections and meaning, allowing us to recognize objects like the ship. Third, Merleau-Ponty has us consider an image where a hidden figure, figure 1, is camouflaged within another design, figure 2. Recognizing figure 1 in figure 2 depends on how your current perception organizes itself. It requires you to perceive figure 2 as potentially containing figure 1. Resemblance alone isn't sufficient. You must already be attuned to seeing figure 2 in a way that allows figure 1 to emerge from it. This is the idea of intentionality, and it underscores how intentionality in perception is crucial for recognition, rather than the sensory information or stored mental representations. So recognition is not about automatic associations between sensory inputs or memory, but about how perception is structured in the present moment. The organization of our perceptual field determines whether recognition can occur. Merleau-Ponty argues that if perception were merely a combination of raw sensations and stored memories, it would lack coherence and stability. Objects would appear fragmented and intangible, making them impossible to grasp as unified entities. And notably, we can actually see this in some studies that have explored the binding problem, where when perceptual attention is not applied to an object, but instead the mind is distracted by some particular object on the screen, while other objects of different colors and shapes show up in the periphery, and then you have the participant report back what they see, they will not report back necessarily the correct object. So they might have seen a red circle in the periphery of their vision, and they might have seen a blue square. But when you ask them what they saw, you will have these what are called illusory conjunctions, this combining of discrete sensory information in an incorrect way. So even though they never saw a blue circle, they'll take the blue from the rectangle and the shape of the red circle and bring those together and maybe provide the answer a blue circle. And so that was never presented to them, but their mind is creating these connections in haphazard ways when perceptual attention is not directed at those objects. And so for Merleau-Ponty, perception is not a secondary process dependent on other mental faculties. It is an original text that carries its own inherent meaning. Perception itself is primary. It generates meaning directly rather than passively reflecting or reconstructing it from past experience. A final implication of empiricism addressed in this chapter concerns the place of cultural objects. Merleau-Ponty argues that empiricism further impoverishes perception by ignoring the cultural and human dimensions of experience, reducing landscapes, objects, and faces to mere physical properties, excluding the emotions, meanings, and values we perceive in them, such as joy in a landscape, anger in a face, or the character of a city. By treating these as projections of internal states or accidents of memory, empiricism denies the inherent meaning of the human world, where our thoughts and feelings naturally extend into shared spaces and relationships. Perception is a dynamic process where objects present themselves with intrinsic significance. An object can feel attractive or repulsive before we even notice its shape or color. And as we'll later see, perception is fundamentally intersubjective rather than purely intrasubjective. Recognizing this richer view of perception restores the human world as the true foundation of our thoughts and actions, rather than isolating consciousness from its lived reality. Next time, we'll consider the roles of attention and judgment in perceptual experience. So thank you for getting all the way to the end of this video. And if you got something out of it, you can support this work in several ways: liking the video, sharing it, subscribing if you haven't already, and you can also support this work financially through the Super Thanks button here on YouTube and through Patreon, where you can become an ongoing regular supporter. And over there I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, copies of the diagrams I use in these videos, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. I want to thank the following who are already supporting this work over on Patreon. Depending on what time I get this video uploaded, you will likely be seeing this in the new year. And so I hope you have a good start to 2025. I'm looking forward to another year of continuing the work on this channel. I have no plan to slow down. In fact, I really only, my main New Year's resolution this year is to find ways to be more efficient in how I get these videos out, so I can get them out more quickly without compromising the quality of the analyses I'm attempting to do here. We'll see how we can figure that out, but as always, I'm grateful for your support and time, and until next time, be well.